War and Revolution, Chapter 2, The Revolutionary Cycle and Terror, Britain, France, America. Section, Ideological Intoxication, Ignorance, and Venality. We have identified the central theme in the liquidation of the French Revolution undertaken by historical revisionism, the denunciation of ideological abstraction and fanaticism. It is important to dwell on diagnoses of this disease. In France, leadership of political life was assumed by intellectuals and men of letters, make-believe substitutes for a ruling class. This was, quote, the social group most lacking in political experience, in fact exhibiting frenzy or collective frenzy, and behaving like drug addicts. The author of these statements is Furet, who invites us to dispense with a historiography based on fidelity to the revolutionary consciousness and experience of the 19th and 20th centuries, on sympathetic identification with Robespierre or Lenin. Quote, there was a gulf between the revolution's true outcome and the revolutionaries' intentions. Hence, its history cannot continue to be written on the basis of the subjective consciousness of its protagonists. Quote, revolutionary times are precisely the most difficult to understand, since they are often periods when the veil of ideology hides most completely the real meaning of the events from the protagonists. End quote. Admirers of the Great Revolution to the last, Marx and Engels nevertheless on many occasions reveled in highlighting the contrast between the intentions of its leaders, especially the Jacobins, and objective outcomes. Consequently, fierce resistance on the part of a Marxist-inspired historiography to the methodological point that no consciousness is more ideological, in the Marxist sense of the term, than that of the revolutionaries is paradoxical. In historical revisionism, the critique of the revolutionary consciousness of the protagonists of revolution, in fact, takes the form of an indictment of intellectuals. In the course of it, Furet adopts themes and arguments from opponents of Jacobinism and the French revolutionary cycle. One thinks in the first instance of Burke, remorseless in his polemic against, quote, mechanic philosophy, bereft of any sense of reality and incapable of escaping the magical accursed circle of abstract principle and chimera, in fact, prey to a permanent state of intoxication. With particular reference to the Jacobins, Constant refers to delirium. Across the Atlantic, Hamilton was in no doubt that the Enrages were madmen. This diagnosis was revived at each stage of the French revolutionary cycle. In the years following the 1848 revolution and its failure, Tocqueville warned against a virus of a new and unknown kind, while after the Paris Commune, it was Taine's turn to denounce the disturbed mental balance of the Jacobins, as well as the contagion, similar to the mysterious disease usually found in poor quarters, rampant in revolutionary France, which was inebriated on the strong liquor of the social contract. This is a topos which, with successive variations and modifications, comes down to Cochin and Furet. In addition to citing the student of the Société de Pensée, Furet refers with a special warmth to Tocqueville, concerned about the spread of the revolutionary virus in France, and makes constant reference to Burke, who was the first to diagnose mental intoxication as the original evil of the French Revolution. Another great admirer of the British Whig is Talman, who in turn denounces the paranoid streak characteristic of Rousseau, Robespierre, Saint-Just, and Babeuf. Diagnosis of the revolutionary disease links historical revisionism and neoliberalism. In the course of the debate, in fact, the fierce ideological struggle that exploded after 1789, we witness a remarkable exchange of accusations. Branded as madmen, Robespierre and Marat stigmatized their enemies as servile and venal, as the kept men of despots, and authors of mercenary rhapsodies or hired sophists. Even before the outbreak of the Revolution, Rousseau, today dismissed as a paranoiac, scorned jurists intent on proving the legitimacy of slavery and tyranny as sold to tyranny and mercenaries. Across the Rhine, addressing the opponents of revolutionary France, Fichte exclaimed, quote, "On our side stand the most lucid heads and most noble hearts of the various nations, and on your side nothing but simpletons, hypocrites, and corrupt intellectuals." End quote. In his turn, however, the idealist philosopher was included by Constant among the lunatics with more or less Jacobin ideas. The attitude of both parties is readily intelligible. The bitterness of the struggle and the unprecedented character of constant upheavals left little alternative. Impelled by their pathos of reason and morality to challenge an order that in their view was irrational and immoral, the revolutionaries were led to attribute the resistance and obstacles they encountered to ignorance or subjective bad faith. On the other side, the frenzy of negation and destruction of age-old arrangements and relations was bound to appear as a deviation from the natural order of things, hence lunacy, in the eyes of those who were bound to such institutions and relations by multiple ties. It might be said to be a clash between rational and moral self-evidence, appealed to by intellectuals furthest removed from the centers of power, and sociological self-evidence, referred to by the social classes closest to wealth and power. It involved two forms of self-evident truth, both of which were illusory and yet deeply felt by the protagonists in the struggle, who were incapable of developing an analysis of objective contradictions, or were rendered as such. In their exchange of accusations, the two parties sometimes employed categories that, prima facie, were identical, but whose meaning was profoundly different in each instance. The fanaticism denounced by the supporters of Enlightenment and revolutionary leaders, with their focus on the mass social base of the Ancien Regime, was synonymous with superstition, ignorance, lack of enlightenment, and unthinking attachment to what exists. The fanaticism pointed to by opponents of the revolution involved condemnation of abstraction, the destructive frenzy of the enlightened, reason that dissects living things conceptually rather than existentially. It is the tremendous power of the negative referred to by Hegel, which in the modern era is embodied in an intelligentsia employing a dangerous degree of independence from power in the dominant classes. Intellectuals organically linked to the existing political and social system appear servile and corrupt to intellectuals who are freischwebend, in Mannheim's celebrated expression. The latter, by virtue of apparently floating free of constraints in a space remote from existing politico-social concreteness, cannot but seem insane to their opponents. At this point we can draw an initial conclusion. Furet correctly stresses the discrepancy between the role objectively played by revolutions in historical change and the perception of that role by contemporaries. But he fails to live up to his own methodological criterion. Genuine distanciation from the lived experience of the protagonists of revolutionary upheavals is matched by substantial identification with the experience of their antagonists. Thus is explained the reemergence of the category or metaphor of the revolutionary disease, which not by chance triumphed in the years of the Restoration. In such a way, objects Hegel, rather than regarding the upheavals as the expression of objective contradictions, everything is explained by recourse to an anomaly and transient pathological paroxysm. This type of explanation is reiterated by historical revisionism. Diagnosis of the malady undergoes subsequent development and refinement. An attempt is made to take account of developments in psychology, psychoanalysis, or sociology, so as to clarify the genesis of the ideological intoxication, already denounced by Burke. but it is basically faithful to the formulation of the British Whig, who, according to Nolte, is to be credited with having foreseen the catastrophic results of the ideological fanaticism diffused even before 1789 among the authors of the Encyclopedia. To appreciate the one-sidedness of this approach, it suffices to compare it with that of Burckhardt, who summarized the explosions produced by great historical crises thus, quote, "The fierceness of these struggles, the unleashing of passion on both sides. Each side defends what it holds most sacred, on the one hand, an abstract loyalty and a religion, on the other a New World Order." End quote. The fury of the struggle prompts an indifference as to methods on both sides, resulting in general massacres, which, however, do not seem to arouse particular indignation. End of section.